The nice thing about approaching the lockout in 2009 is that it's still quite some time away, and it gives you the latitude to sort of have tests, if you like, and have places of experiment where you don't have the kind of, oh my God, 10 minutes to go and have to get an exhibition up kind of approach. My own background, I would have studied history, that's my primary degree, and politics in UCD. So it's very much a kind of methodology for me to feel secure about what happened, or at least to know what the possible versions of what happened might be, as well as feeling I have this need for things to be embedded rather deeply if you're going to make any points out of it. So that time afforded me the possibility of thinking about how you would approach this in a considered and discursive way. I think, again, almost in homage to the lockout, I thought it was important to enfranchise and to include a wide constituency rather than be marginally self-appointed as the kind of decider about how things should be. And what I felt my responsibility within my practice, my curatorial practice, but also as a citizen, would be to not ride roughshod over some developments or some interest groups that would have the lockout at its heart, would have been working on quite some time and would have a great deal to offer, but that they be included in the notion of a front edge expression. So the way I figured of enfranchising that was to have 3 public forum, which was supported by the Arts Council. It couldn't have happened otherwise. And within that, in gestural terms, provide an armature that was demonstrating the inclusiveness of it. So our first one was in Liberty Hall, and our second one was in the Rotunda Hospital's oval room. The third one was in the Abbey Theatre, that's right, in the Peacock. Which again was a sort of a culmination, because we kind of went back to an artistic womb, if you like, for the gestation. The idea of the lockout and what it engenders, self-determination, certainly is one of them. The strike happened, and essentially when we talk about lockout, we think that's the strike. Actually, what happened was the workers were locked out by the employers. That continued for the following 3 months with solidarity from other working spheres. And so you had the working man, the working position, grind to a halt in the city, with a lot of scab workers being brought in the same way as it happened in the 80s and the 70s, as we now have footage on telly. But at that time, obviously, you depend on some recordings, and say people like William Orpen, who would be a well-known Irish painter of the time, has really strong footage of soup kitchens, not footage, paintings, drawings, sketches of soup kitchens. Similarly, John Cook of the National Archive, Photographic Archive, at the time he took photographs of what the conditions were in Dublin, called Darkest Dublin. Actually, Christian Corlett has produced a wonderful book, and you know that it's not a minor scuffle. You know that the conditions are about to explode. You see the tenement living and the conditions within which people live, and how insupportable that is. The other really important thing that came out of the lockout was the ability to self-organise, and that feeds into the citizen army, which played a crucial role for the 1916. The ideas around autonomy. You're essentially extending the disintegration of the divine right of kings for the average person, and the notion of being able to take control of your own destiny. And again, it's hard to see why that wouldn't be extremely relevant today as well, in the idea of who decides. But at the time, these would have been revolutionary and rather kind of unthought of, daring things, and probably thought of by most Irish people as subversive, as something that was, not for the greater good, and could only end in tears. If we return to the points at which we can make decisions, and Jack O'Connor mentions this in one of the forum that we put together, that there is a sort of a fork in the way at certain points in history, and in looking back at it, and the use of history in broad terms would be to illuminate these kinds of points of decision making. And when you look back at the lockout now, you see very clearly there was a choice, I think anyway, choice that you either throw your lot in with the European mass, or you have a bigger vision that you can take part in, or you go for a replication of the way things were, only a different set of masters. And in many ways that choice was made for probably the I suppose you can rarely say that the seeds of our own destruction were at that particular point then, but it has to be said that the choice we made then has precipitated probably a replication of a colonial system, I think, in early modern Ireland, that just had a different masters. Arising out of these forums, it has become clear that you have that three strands to this exhibition can be envisaged. The contemporary, which has in contemporary art, the difficulty is very often that it has to be almost ahead of its time in order to be relevant, if that's not a contradiction. It has to almost be misunderstood in order to get it right. It has to be a minority interest in order not to have to cave into sort of big banner stuff in order to endure and then to be relevant. However, that in this context probably isn't enough if you're going to talk about an exhibition. So you have the other strand, you have the historical, you have the reflective, you have the place where the trade unions, for example, have their tradition of banners, flags, badges, that kind of paraphernalia that is attached to their history. There's also the lockout and the social history section in Ireland, who very definitely will be celebrating or marking this occasion. And then you have the hybrid, and the hybrid presents the place for me where the citizen can read the past and the future as a sort of a narrative place where they feel comfortable. Yara Bubnova was interesting in one of the guests that we had speak at the earlier forum, and her notion that you find what works in a city, you find the character of the city, and you try and develop a formula that has some kind of embedded place within the city, so that you're not having a sort of an unnatural intervention, but you're not also having an invisible intervention, but that you're going with the vocabulary of the place to an extent. So my view of how this exhibition might pan out was, as O'Connell Street is a public domain where we have the site of protest through the ages. It's also significant, as I said, for lockout, that it makes sense for it to be in the public domain on O'Connell Street. What might that mean? Well, it might entail looking at the structures in O'Connell Street as a fixed structure, but almost structures that are ignored at the moment. How many of us can name who the statues are on O'Connell Street? How many of us could remember any of the sort of, even the floozy, the jacuzzi, that one, that even that seems like it never happened, but it did. There's just a whole sort of memory that you have to tap into when you're dealing with the public domain. I think that it's really difficult to ask a state or a people to support something that could very easily be both subversive of that structure or rejected, or and expect that they would pay for it as well, sort of thing. The state, however, I think we do have to remember that the state is the citizen. We worked on this in the sort of the idea of the state we're in. Was the name of the first forum, and that was both a reference to the kind of difficulties, but it was also the fact that, we are the state, we the citizens. So there is a need for us not to think, I think, that state commissions don't have some element of truth in them. I do think that it's important to look at the nature of art in the public arena commissioned by the state as having more than a little clue about who we are, and understanding that, we're responsible for that. Having said that, as I say, it's a little difficult to imagine somebody signing up to a very subversive piece that is going to criticise structures and then pay for it. However, the contemporary side of things is almost perverse in that way, where, as I said, in order for it to be doing the job it has to do, it almost has to be indecipherable. And how you do that in the public space is, for me, the challenge or the tension of public art commissioning these days. And the idea of value for money. This is a difficulty in that sometimes value for money isn't apparent till a lot later. But does that mean that you don't do anything, or do you commission anything? For contested spaces, and the idea of diminishing public space, and the idea of ownerships that move, so that, say, for example, you have a cafe that has a pavement sort of area that they almost colonize. I use that word advisedly, that where you're talking about that kind of encroachment and the understandings that people are almost like closing into themselves. That's a really interesting challenge for public space, which I think is current, and I think that that's at the moment one where a lot of really planned thought can go into what is commissioned, where and why. The other aspect, which I think is a little bit difficult, is, do you commission it as a permanent piece, or is it for a length of time, so that there's this idea that, well, if you don't like it, we can take it away in 5 years. Those kind of issues, again, it's about responsibility and commitment, but I think process is very important, but it's a moving target.